having my COVID shot today.
You know, that second one can do it to you.
This is just the first one.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Although I guess the first one did make Dawn a little tired.
But I've heard the second one sometimes.
Yeah, Dawn had a kind of rough time with it. From her neck down to her wrist hurt. Yeah, she didn't have a fever or anything. She was just, just hurt.
So be it.
Oh, I forgot my other phone. So hello to everybody who might be out there or who is coming out there. I forgot my other phone, so I won't be able to see if you have any questions. Oh, goodness. This is my life.
This is your life. This is my life.
Oh, goodness. So, I'm going to just kind of get started with a little introductory statement. Next week I'm going on vacation.
Oh.
Going to North Carolina for the suspended celebration. All of us turned 50 last year. So, all of our friends from high school are gathering together and
Sounds good.
celebrating our 50th. I asked my friend's wife who where we're staying in North Carolina, I said, so it's about to look like someone spilled a box full of 50-year-old hooligans in your house. You sure you got enough room for everybody? And also, as I was thinking about this last week, I've just kind of been marching through the chapters and describing what happens in them and not really doing any kind of analysis or anything. And this last bit really put a couple of ideas in my head. So I thought we'll take next week off since I'll be gone. And then the following week we'll do basically an analysis of 1 Samuel, because there's no way we're going to make our way through 2 Samuel before the end of Lent. So we'll save that for next time. Because, a lot of stuff go on in here. A lot of weird stuff goes on in here.
It was weird.
If you ever doubt that the people of the Bible are human, just read 1 Samuel. I am kind of stalling, but we left off last week that Samuel had died. I think it's the third time, maybe the fourth, where we get this kind of new character, new story thing. So, and there was a man in Maon, Maon, whose stock was in Carmel.
Every time I read it, I pronounce that one different.
Yeah. For anybody who else is listening that's out there, if you ever wonder how to read the names of things in the Bible, the trick is you read it with confidence, because no one else knows how to read it either. So you say it like you know what you're saying, nobody will be the wiser. But the whole book began. Well, she thought she was going to be the only one.
Yeah.
And since we're only just getting started, I'll tell you again what I just told her and whoever else might be out there, though it's likely nobody. people do watch it during the week.
Right.
So, but next week is when I'm on vacation.
Oh,
And there's no way we're going to trudge through 2 Samuel also by the end of Lent. And since I've been basically just kind of going through the chapters and highlighting a couple things here and there and telling the story and not doing any really kind of theological or pastoral stuff with it, I thought it would be better to go on the 25th when we meet again to do that with 1 Samuel.
Oh, okay.
And then, since the following Thursday is Maundy Thursday, I don't know if we're doing anything or not, but just in case we do, we probably won't meet then either. So,
So just one more time.
yeah. And we'll talk about 1 Samuel and all the stuff. Because there were some things that hit me in the end of this one, especially that it's like, okay, I see, I'm beginning to see some things, some recurring patterns. But we were just talking about the fact that it begins with, and there was a man, which is how the whole book starts. So, and, you know, even when we get to the introduction of Saul, it begins with, you know, and there was a man in chapter 9 of Benjamin. And I think there was another one. Yeah, it was when they're introducing David's family, right? So it was, and there was a man, and then it talks about David's lineage. So now we have the introduction, and there was a man, so we clearly have a shift in the story. And I was explaining to everybody that the way to pronounce names like Maon or Mon, there, M-A-O-N, for the town, is to do it with confidence, because no one else knows how to pronounce it either. And his name is Nabal, N-A-B-A-L, and his wife's name is Abigail. Nabal, by the way, when Abigail says later on, as she meets up with David, that he is just like his name. The name Nabal means a base fellow, or he's churlish, or he's a fool. So it might not even be a name. It just might. If it is a name, it's a mean name that his parents gave him. So he's got herds, flocks, all that kind of good stuff. And David, who is still wandering around, apparently has done him a favor without him asking by protecting his flocks and the people who are watching over it. And apparently, according to the note here, when it's shearing time, there's a little bit of a celebration. So this is why there's a feast going on. And David's like, hey, can we have some of that? And you know, sometimes I wonder if this guy here who's making comment doesn't fall into the same trap I do, you know, or any of us might do with equating modern politics with it. Because he says, you know, it's really unclear as to, you know, why David's doing this. I mean, and I'm thinking, well, he's hungry, he's wandering around. I mean, that kind of makes sense. But the way he's describing it, he says, it's not real clear if he just kind of did it out of the goodness of his heart, or if this was like, you know, protection money, like mob style type thing. And I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of pushing it, but I don't know.
Well, then when he doesn't pay and he's gonna kill him,
yeah,
you know, then I guess
you can see where he would get that idea. Because that's what he does. He's like, oh, look, I did this for you. Can we have some? And the guy's like, no. Why would I do that? And so, and he actually calls him. He actually gets pretty nasty because in verse 10, where he says, "Who is David and who is the son of Jesse?" Which sounds a lot like Saul when David killed Goliath. He says, "These days many are the slaves breaking away from their masters. And shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I slaughtered for my shears and give it to men who came from I know not where?" As though he's saying David, because he's fighting against Saul, is just another slave or servant who's fleeing his master. So it's kind of a sneaky insult. Which makes more sense than why David would go, "All right, we're killing this guy for calling me that and for saying that about me." Especially after what just happened. Because what just happened? He saved his life. He spared him. And Nabal's wife, Abigail, finds out about it. And she heads out. She hurried and fetched 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, 5 dressed sheep. There's that bread, wine, and sheep again. Then 5 seahs of parched grain, 100 raisin cakes, and 200 fig cakes. And she says, "Pass on ahead of me, and I'll be coming right after you." But she doesn't tell her husband. When she finally catches up with David, she flings herself at his feet and says what we know based on his name. His name means base, and there's baseness in him. "And as for me, your servant, I never saw the Lord's servants whom you sent." So she's asking for, "Forgive, pray the crime of your servant, for the Lord will surely make my Lord a stalwart house." But all of this stuff, sending presents on ahead and then falling at the feet of the person who's coming after you, is very much like Jacob returning from Laban, where the night before he has wrestled with the angel. Well, in the days prior to that, he's been separating everybody, sending them off in different directions with so much of his stuff, and then he sends a party ahead the day before to meet up with Esau to give him all these gifts to kind of stay his hand from attacking Jacob, because he thinks that's what Esau wants to do, because he snookered him out of his birthright. And then as soon as he sees Esau, he flings himself on his face at Esau's feet and basically begs for forgiveness, just like this. So there's kind of some echoes of that going on here. In fact, the same word that she uses, the blessing that your servant has brought, in verse 27, is the same word that Jacob uses talking about the stuff that he sent off to Esau. And then we have an echo back to, I'm interested to see how yours phrases it. Verse 29, this is how mine reads. "When a person rises to pursue you, to seek your life, my Lord's life will be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God." And here's the part that I'm interested in. "And the lives of your enemies he will sling from the hollow of the sling." Is that how yours reads?
Hurl away as from a pocket of a sling.
Okay.
Mine was from the hollow.
Okay. So this is interesting because David used a sling.
Right. I noticed that too. Like,
And then when Abigail goes back, there's all this revelry. she doesn't tell him. She doesn't tell Nabal anything. Waits for him to wake up the next morning and tells him. And I love the way it's phrased. And it happened in the morning when the wine was gone out of Nabal. That his wife told him these things. What things? Did she tell him what she did in order to spare everybody? Or did she say, David's still coming? Because this phrase, his heart died within him, sounds like whatever he heard gave him a heart attack.
Yeah, but didn't David tell her that he had accepted what she had brought and to go home in peace and had heard your words and granted your request?
Yeah, but so, reading her stuff, I don't think she was very happily married.
Right.
And she actually, there's some phrasing in here. That she uses. I'm trying to find it. That what she says, and you will remember your servant. Well, what does she have in mind for remembering your servant?
Yeah.
Is she
Wants to be his wife?
Yeah, and is that what she's planning? It worked. And this actually is interesting. I want to read this note to you. It's in reference to verses 30 and 31. It says, when the Lord appoints you prince over Israel, this will not be a stumbling and a trepidation of the heart to my Lord. And the note here is, Abigail deftly pitches her argument to David's political self-interest. Once he makes the move from guerrilla chieftain to monarch, he will not want his record stained by the blood he spilled. It's therefore more prudent to let God take care of his enemies. Like she says, and the Lord will, where's this at? And the Lord will do well with the Lord. And no cause for my Lord to have carried out his own rescue. Then the Lord will do well with my Lord, and you will remember your servant, blessed is Lord God of Israel. Well, his argument here is the phrase, this kind of the Lord in biblical parlance, being the piously proper way to talk about the course of events. So don't you be the one who kills Nabal. Let the Lord take care of it. And this last part is what funny. It says its pragmatic equivalent is basically other people or circumstances. So let someone else kill him. Let his own circumstances kill him. But with that idea that maybe she's saying let someone else kill him, is she saying, not saying any names, but let me handle this? So does she know that he's got this weak heart, that Nabal has this weak heart? And so when she goes to tell him, she actually says David's a day out or something like that, and he has the heart attack? Or does she say, this is what I did? I don't know. It's interesting. But it's funny because when she says he will sling his enemies, he will sling from the hollow of the sling. We have that after Nabal heard these things, his heart died within him, and he became like a stone, which is what you put in the hollow of a sling. So
So it doesn't say anything about God talking to Abigail or anything, but I guess that's just how I perceive it. That she could see that David was, anointed or and going to be a king or
Or that he was hot.
Pardon?
Or that he was hot, because it mentioned that he was good looking.
Right, I know, but, so I just, but you're right. I mean, it doesn't mention that anywhere
Yeah.
here. I just was like, oh, she knows, how important David is, where Nabal didn't.
Well, she might. She very well might, too. But like you said, it doesn't say it.
No, it
But
doesn't.
she might. I mean, his name has been around because he's a general. He's a leader of thousands, right?
You know what you say. And more. Yeah, like, maybe she just was like, oh, he's hot.
This is
I'm going to try and get on his good side. You're into that soap opera, making this a soap opera.
I was telling Marcia before you guys got here. I said if you ever wonder if the people in the Bible are actually human beings, all you have to do is read 1 Samuel, because they are clearly fallible human beings. So David doesn't waste any time after hearing that Nabal dies. He sends and says, "Hey, want to come be my wife? Wife number 3?" But in the process of this, Saul, remember, because David's married to Michal, who is Saul's daughter, he decides, and it even says here, and Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, but apparently he decided Palti, son of Laish, was supposed to be her husband. So he gave him to her instead. Is that because he wants to remove a part of David's claim to the throne as the son-in-law to the king? Was it even legal? At the very least, it sounds like he's just playing with people, doesn't it?
How that happened, because I mean, it says she was David's wife, so how
Yeah.
are you David's wife and then you get given to somebody else?
Well, it certainly is
Been gone for a while, so.
It certainly is a commentary on the plight of women back then, don't you think? Because Michal is the only woman in the Bible who's said to have loved anyone, a man, David particularly.
Right.
And here he's like, yeah, you're not his wife anymore, you're his wife. In 2 Samuel, Michal goes back to David. And Palti, the guy who she's with now, in another one of those scenes you don't see anywhere else in the Bible, is literally chasing after her, blubbering, professing his love for her. Which, makes you feel really bad for him. He actually loved this woman. But, who is he and who is she? They're both just nobodies who are to be used for whatever purpose, I guess. So, we are hot on the heels of this reconciliation between David and Saul. And some Ziphites come to Saul and say, hey, David's hiding out over here. And what does he do? He went out to get him. He went out to kill him. What is Saul's problem?
Like we talked about last week.
Well, yeah. And I've been thinking about what you said, Steve. Is he just completely numbed to life in general? So, in a little bit of there's some similarities here because somebody informed Saul last time, and so he went out and was looking for David. This time, David is the one who goes out looking for Saul, sends spies out, and he finds him, and so they go into camp, and everybody's asleep. I do think it's funny that later on it was like, they were all asleep, for the Lord's deep slumber had fallen upon them. That's a convenient tool, isn't it? And David has a couple of people with him. One who is probably his nephew. That's Abishai, son of Zuriah, who is David's sister. So that's probably his nephew. And Ahimelech the Hittite, who sounds very eager, in much the same way as Doeg. What was Doeg? The one who killed all the priests? Well, well, anyway, the foreign merc, right? Who kills all the priests. So here's another one who seems to have picked up with him. And he's like, and he says the same thing that was said last time when they ran into Saul. God has this day delivered your enemy into your hand. Although he doesn't mince words, he's, let me pray, strike him through with a spear into the ground just once. I will need no second blow. Which might remind you that Saul threw his spear 2 times at David. Threw it at him twice. Does that make sense?
Right.
But no, this one's only going to take 1. David stops him.
It says the Lord will kill him.
What's that?
It says the Lord will kill him.
Yes, he does.
You don't have to carry the guilt.
Which again is, is this piety? Being faithful to God, or is this being politically shrewd? Because there's plenty of evidence in these last few chapters of this book that David is politically shrewd. We'll get to those, but the second of the kingly symbols is taken. So the first one was when he cut the robe in the cave. So he's taken a portion of that robe, which is a sign of the king, and then he takes the king's spear. And his water jug. Which is interesting because, the spear protects life in battle and water protects life from the desert. So basically it's taken away his protection. Which makes it, this call out to Abner even more snarky. Because he walks a fair distance away and then he wakes everybody up. Particularly Abner, and he's like, dude, aren't you supposed to protect the king?
What good are you?
What good are any of you? All of you were asleep. I walked in, took the stuff, walked out. Saul recognizes David's voice and again calls him my son. So a second time David spares him, second time Saul calls him my son. We have a lot of callbacks to that when he calls himself a single flea. And then chasing a partridge into the mountains.
And didn't he And he added, "Why does my Lord pursue his servant? For what have I done?"
Mm-hmm.
Didn't it?
Yeah,
That happened before.
Yeah, 2 chapters ago.
Right.
So
he's wanting to know
what's going on? Yeah. Why do you, I mean, you know, because he had heard. I mean, after Saul came after him, David hears that Saul had come after him. So it's like, wow, that coming after him is, you know, coming after him with an intent to harm David. So David is still confused. What have I done to deserve this? And Saul, in another kind of repentance, maybe, says, "I have offended. Come back, my son David, for I will not harm you again, inasmuch as my life was precious in your eyes this day." And David clearly does not believe him.
Say, "I have been a fool and have made a great mistake."
Yeah, which he said before, right?
Right.
So David says, "Here's your spear." Just to show you that I have, you know, I'm still of good intent. Send someone over to get it; they'll be fine. But Saul does modify what he says, because last time he's like, when he gives David the blessing, he's talking about how he will be a better king. This one is just kind of this vague, "You shall surely do much, and you shall surely win out." And David went on his way, which is not going to be Saul's way, because that ship has clearly sailed. So David went on his way, which is wandering and homeless, and Saul returned to his place, which is a palace and, you know, servants and all that kind of stuff. And David, and this is actually the first time you get, in all of this, David talking to himself. So David has this conversation with himself, and he's come to the conclusion that if he stays in town, Saul's going to kill him. So where does he go?
Land of the Philistines.
Not just anywhere.
Enemies.
The enemies. Back to Gath, where Goliath is from. Back to Achish, whom he acted crazy in front of.
Oh, okay. I remember that.
And he hangs out there for a while and asks for a place of his own. And the way that it's described in here is that when it says David stayed with Achish and Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, David with his 2 wives. So with 600 men, wives, and children, odds are they're pretty close to 2,000 people. So he asks for his own town, which is interesting enough because, I mean, think if we had an influx of 2,000 people into Augusta in one day. Where would we put them? Nowhere. There's just no place for them. But he went there to Ziklag. Now here's where we get a little bit. Again, is it political acumen or some other motivation? Because it says where David goes. He goes up and they raid Geshurite and the Gerizite and the Amalekite. All these people who are the, you know, enemies of Israel and have been fighting with them ever since they left Egypt, trying to take over the land. And he kills every man and woman alive. He doesn't do the ban like was asked for with the Amalekites, where he's supposed to kill all the cattle and everything too, because he takes those. So he's building himself quite the fortune. And then he goes to Achish and he asks, where has he been raiding? And David lies to him. He tells him he's been raiding all of these places in Israel. Judah, and Jeramelite, and the Kenite, and all these places were attached to Judah. So he's lying to Achish, saying that he's been attacking Israel, when he's really been attacking these other places, which probably wouldn't have been a bad thing, because those other places were also enemies of the Philistines.
Oh, they were?
Yeah.
And both. That's what
Yeah.
I had a hard time understanding this right here, because I was like, is that different names for what he, I didn't realize he was lying to Achish.
Yeah.
By saying he was raiding Israel places.
Yeah, because both Israel and Philistines were...
Say this is what David did, so that...
He's killing everybody so that nobody can go back and tell Achish where he's really attacking.
Okay.
That's kind of the narrator's excuse anyway. Seems to be giving him an out for killing everybody.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, but again...
Like, what, these places, none of Achish's men go and see that, oh, there's, Judah's still regular, or whatever, Jeremiel has still got people in it, like, nobody ever comes back to them and goes, no, there's still people there,
Apparently not. Either that or the narrator doesn't think it's important.
Right.
So, yeah, it's... And why lie? But why lie in the first place? Because he's, again, all these other places he's been, these are enemies of Philistines too. Israel and Philistia were both latecomers to the region, settlers who weren't native there. The Philistines came from the Aegean, Israel came up out of Egypt. So what would Achish have cared? Unless his goal was to be, that last part of verse 12. He has surely become repugnant to Israel, and he will be my perpetual vassal. And not only that, at the end of the chapter, I shall make you my bodyguard for life. So did he lie about where he's going in order to gain political capital with Achish? I mean, it seems like a shrewd thing to do. And I do love the way that he gives the non-answer to Achish when he says, when they're going up to do battle with Israel, and Achish says, you surely know that you must sally forth with me in the ranks, both you and your men. And David said, then you yourself know what your servant will do. None of that echo pattern that usually happens in the scriptures. He's like, just kind of this vague, then you know what I'm going to do. Any other thoughts on that whole? It's going to come back in a couple minutes, or in about a chapter or so. But first we have to take a side trip and be reminded word for word that Samuel had died and all Israel mourned.
Right.
But this is important to this part of the story, because what's he going to do? What's Saul going to do? He's going to call on Samuel's ghost.
Yeah.
And here's an interesting addenda to that. Saul had taken away the ghosts and the familiar spirits from the land. That word, what does yours say for familiar spirits? It's probably something different.
What verse? What number?
Verse 3. And Saul had taken away mediums and spiritists. Okay, we'll actually get to that one in just a second.
Buried him in his own city. Saul had expelled the mediums and the wizards from the land.
Mediums and wizards?
Yeah, so they had, what was medium?
Like a person that you go to that can tell the future or can call somebody.
Right, I know that, but they had them back then and wizards?
Yeah.
It's certainly not unheard of in the scriptures. But when you go to, this sounds like Saul just came up with it, but it's in Leviticus that you don't consult them. So that's when people say that, well, there's no such thing as ghosts, or the Bible says there's no such thing as ghosts. Well, that clearly is not the case, because they show up often, and especially in these stories. And second of all, God doesn't say that they don't exist, just don't consult them. So the words here for familiar spirits. Yidanim. This is where I've been enjoying this one, because he explains every word choice, just about every word choice he makes. This word right here, originally, and you put a dash here because you can put different vowel points in there, is the root word, which is also where you get yada. Or to know. So when someone says, and Adam knew his wife, yada is there. But also it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the reason I think this is funny is because there is this kind of hidden link there to knowledge, and what's poor Saul's fate through most of the story. He don't know nothing.
Right, you can't. God's not talking to him. Nobody's telling him what he's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Samuel's the only one that's ever.
And he usually just is mad at him.
Right.
So, yours said mediums, wizards, and spiritualists or spiritists. So, do you know what a metonym is? It's a word that's used to that's equated with another word, but think like the best example is this. Okay, so you can say the crown. Well, when you say something is in reference to the crown, what are you talking about?
King.
Yeah, the king or queen, right? So that's the metonym. The crown is the metonym for king or queen. So while the literal translation is ghosts and familiar spirits, it's probably very likely that those were metonyms associated with, and so they just translated it in yours to spiritists or something like that. Because when Saul consults this one, we'll get to that in a second. I just thought it was funny that this whole thing. Anyway, we have Saul takes away, these people, forbids them from consulting, which is you're not supposed to do anyway, according to Leviticus. And then the Philistines gather, and all Israel gathers, and Saul sees the Philistines. He's afraid, and his heart trembles greatly. That's been going on a lot lately. And what happens next?
Inquired of the Lord, but the Lord didn't answer.
Once again, Saul's looking for answers. He doesn't get any. Neither by dreams, nor by the Urim, nor by prophets. He is out of luck. So what does he say?
For me.
Oh, is that what yours says?
Yeah.
Conjure up for me? What?
Please and bring up for me whom I shall name to you.
Oh, no. Just after Saul is not answered by God. And Saul says to his servants,
Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her.
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So, find a woman who's a medium so I can go and inquire through her, right? The translation here, which goes back to this metonym stuff, is ghost wife. But what's a ghost wife? We don't know what a ghost wife is. We know what a medium is. So I understand that translation, but this kind of keeps with that whole getting rid of ghosts and familiars. Well, here's a ghost wife. But this is also one of those things that as soon as I read it, my mind again comes to modern politics, and it's just like with this whole Saul takes away the medium and spiritist, and the second thing that he does, rules don't apply to me; those are for everybody else. It's good to be the king. So they find him one in Eindor. Saul disguises himself by putting on different clothes. Probably trying to look like a commoner. And then he says, conjure for me a ghost, right? Summon up the one I say to you. And I think this is funny because her response is, look, you yourself know what Saul did. And I'm like, Saul doesn't know anything. Anyway. But that he cut off the ghosts and familiar spirits from the land. So there's that. We talked about that before. That phrase "cut off." It's a death sentence. So why do you entrap me? And Saul swears to her by the Lord, who is the one who first said, "Don't consult these people." And I had to laugh at the commentary here that was in Midrash. And it's, let's see if I can remember it correctly. Something along the lines of, Who does Saul look like in this moment? He looks like a woman who is with her lover and swears on her husband's life. But he promises her nothing's going to happen, and he asks her to summon up Samuel, which is why we needed to be reminded he was dead. So she does. She sees him and she screams out. Well, after she does, when he says summon up Samuel, she sees Samuel.
And then she realizes that he's Saul. And
Yeah.
he deceived her. Yeah. That's what she thinks.
Yep. You're the one who said none of this. But he says, do not fear. What do you see? So clearly, she sees Samuel, but he doesn't at this point. It gets a little weird in this section as to who, because, yeah, we'll get there in a second. And what does yours say as to what she sees?
You see a divine being coming up out of the ground.
Okay.
Mine says old man wearing a robe.
Right. He said to her, "What is his appearance?" She said,
Yeah.
"An old man is coming up. He is wrapped in a robe."
In a cloak.
So
But the
Saul
years.
knew it was Samuel and
Mm-hmm.
bowed his head to the ground and did obedience.
Mm-hmm. But yours says she saw a divine being coming up from the ground, right?
Coming out of the ground.
Yeah, that's what mine says.
Spirit.
Okay. Because the word there is Elohim, which when used in reference to other countries' gods is plural for gods, but in reference to God, it's a capital G, so instead of a plural. So she actually uses that word there. There are some places where it's also used as reference to angels.
So in verse 15 and 15 in that, so Saul thinks he's talking to Samuel's spirit.
That's where it gets confusing because he can't see him because he asks the woman what she sees, but all of a sudden it's like he can.
Yeah, because then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?
Yeah.
I am in great distress for the Philistines that are warring against me, and God has turned away from me."
Yeah, so it seems like he's talking directly to Saul now. Like he can see him now. It's especially confusing because after all of this and stuff, you have the phrase in verse 21, and the woman came to Saul. Like she just kind of excused herself while they had this conversation. Her part was done, I guess. I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, and Saul knew it was Samuel. Interestingly enough, the old man rises up and he's wrapped in a cloak. Why would Samuel know that about, or why would Saul recognize Samuel from that? This is calling back on long-term memory, I know.
Samuel must have wore a coat, huh? A robe.
So this is from chapter 2. And Samuel was ministering in the presence of the Lord, a lad girt in linen ephod, and a cloak would his mother make for him, and would bring up for him year after year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So it's almost like it became just this, this signifier of Samuel, this identifier, this cloak that his mom would make him every year. And like you said, he summons him up, and Samuel is immediately irate because he never ever says nice things to Saul. Why have you troubled to summon me up? And Saul just lets it all out in one long sentence. I'm in dire straits. Philistines fighting against me. God's turned away from me. No one answers me. No prophets. No dreams. I called you to let me know what I should do. And why do you ask me when the Lord has turned away from you and become your foe? Which is a callback to chapter 15. When you did not heed the voice of the Lord. So that echoes, remember how many times that idea of heeding the voice of the Lord showed up in chapter 15? Well, he gives him a prophecy, all right. And what's that? And what else is going to happen? Yeah, tomorrow, you and your sons are with me. How terrifying would that be? So, this is, again, remember when God calls Samuel? What is Samuel's message that he's supposed to deliver to Eli? That you and your sons are going to die. So it's Samuel's giving another message just like he gave to Eli. Eli, you and your house, God's going to kill you all. Saul, you and your house, God's going to kill you all. He's always such a cheerful message giver. Just always good news coming from him. And here we have, so Saul falls face first in the ground, and because he's frightened again. Everybody surprised that Saul's frightened? Right. And then he didn't have the strength to get up because he hadn't eaten food all day and night. Now, why do you think that was?
Tripping.
Mushrooms.
Talking to Samuel and the Spirit.
Well, that's as he's been doing all day and all night. Yeah, it's not really clear on the time frame, is it? No, it's just been a night because they came to the woman by night. But he hadn't eaten all night. But he hadn't eaten all day either, which sounds a whole lot like the fasting before battle. Remember that whole episode? With Jonathan eating the honey and getting in trouble. And then the medium comes back in and says, and here we go. Remember, this is all this is prophesied against him because he did not heed the voice of the Lord. And yet, for the next 3 verses, you get this. Look, your servant has heeded your voice. And I took my life in my hands and heeded your words that you spoke to me. And now you, on your part, pray, heed the voice of your servant. And I shall put before you a morsel of bread and eat, that you may have strength when you go on the way. And he refused and said, I will not eat. And his servants pressed him, and the woman as well, and he heeded their voice. Which is what got him in trouble in the first place. So she says, I'm going to give you a morsel of bread, and she kills, and she gives him some veal. She basically feeds him a feast. And they ate and arose and went off on that night. And so again, if he's hungry because he's fasted, if he's laying there on the floor because he hasn't eaten all day and night because he's fasting the day before battle, along with all of his soldiers, this is another one of those instances. It sounds like he's like, yeah, that's for everybody else. Fine, I'll eat. Fast schmast. And then so this whole chapter, by the way, you'll notice takes place at night. This is important because we're going to jump to the Philistines who are gathering all their camps at Aphek. Why is that important? Does that name sound familiar?
No. They all sound the same.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So this is chapter 4. This is just after Samuel's word was upon all of Israel. This is after he gives the prophecy to Eli about his sons and himself dying. Chapter 4, and Israel sallied forth in battle against the Philistines, and they encamped at Ebenezer, while the Philistines were encamped at Aphek. So that's where they were encamped when they won the battle and took the ark. In chapter 4, it's the first 2 verses.
Oh, there it is.
Philistines take the ark of victory.
So, last time the Philistines gathered at Aphek, Israel was routed and lost the Ark of the Covenant. Do you sense a little foreboding here? Just after, by the way, Samuel pronounces a death sentence on Eli and his sons. So now Samuel has just pronounced a death sentence on Saul and his sons, and the Philistines are back at Aphek. And David was advancing with them, and his Achish's captains have a valid point, right? Calls them Hebrews again, because that's what they are. And they question his loyalty, and they question the wisdom of this move, because they're placed right next to the king. They're his bodyguards. So if they decide they're going to kill the king, and now you got 2 fronts that the Philistines have to fight on. But you have this really weird conversation between Achish and David, which begins with the Philistine king saying, "As the Lord lives." Why would he say that? These are things I wonder. I don't know. But the next thing he says, you are upright. Is he?
No.
Especially to this guy? He's been lying to him the whole time. But we still get this conversation that sounds like it's the one that was between David and Saul at the caves, right? This talk about who has done good and who has done evil in the eyes of the Lord or in the eyes of the Philistine overlords. What have I done? And what have you found in your servant for the day? You know, why would you say this? But he does have... Okay. Verse 8. David says to Achish, but what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day I appeared in your presence until this day, that I should not come and do battle with the enemies of my Lord and my Lord the King? Who is he talking about?
I mean, you think that it's Saul and,
Right?
right,
Because he's an Israelite.
right.
So is he talking about doing battle for his Lord the King Saul? Or Achish? I mean, we know he's sneaky. He's made these kind of vague political statements before. You realize you're going to have to march against Israel with us, right? And you know what I'll do. So when he says, why wouldn't I do battle with the enemies of my Lord the King? Well, which king is he talking about? And therefore, are Achish's captains and, warlords or whatever, overlords right in their...
Hesitant to have them
Yeah.
go with them, yeah.
But verse 10, we have this, so now rise early in the morning, you and the servants of your Lord who have come with you, and rise early in the morning when it is just brightening for you. So Saul is skulking about at night, and David marches when it is brightening. So he marches back home to Ziklag. Finds it burned to the ground. And everyone, all of the women in the from the youngest to the oldest, they put no one to death. But they have this phrase, they drove them off and went on their way. Is that how yours reads it?
Carried them off.
Carried them off? Okay.
Taking captive the women and all who were in it.
Okay, and then what did they do with them? Verse 3. Or the end of 2 and into 3 maybe.
Who were in that boat? both small and great. They killed none of them, but carried them off
Carried them off. Okay.
and went their way.
Okay.
When David and his men came to the city, they found it burned down, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive.
Yep. Okay. So everybody weeps until they cry until they can't cry no more. And even, David's wives were taken also.
All both his wives.
Yep. So he's crying with them. So after we talk about Abigail, wife of Nabal the Carmelite, what does yours say? And David
Was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
David was in great danger, for the people spoke of stoning him because all the people were bitter in his spirit
Yeah, so
for their sons and daughters.
so David is in trouble. Because all these people that have been following him want to stone him now. Which, I mean, these are either extremely fair weather friends, because the minute something doesn't go their way, they want to stone him. But again, doesn't this kind of sound familiar? Not just war, but the moment some political figure doesn't do what you want him to do. Or what some group doesn't want them to do. Even though they were all for him, stone him.
Recall.
Yep.
Yeah,
Again, every now and then it just strikes me with this. It's like, yeah, that's all very familiar.
But, so obviously his men knew what they were doing, who they were killing, and probably knew what David was telling the king,
Probably.
so possibly felt like they were being used, and now we come, we didn't, whether the ultimate plan was to kill Akish, when they went.
And
then they got turned away, or,
Yeah.
But whatever, they didn't get to go through with it, and then they come back and they're, all their family's gone.
Yeah, which makes me think that maybe that's what you made me think of by saying that was maybe if David had told the truth to Akish, then Akish would have let him keep at least some people back because he knew the Amalekites were nearby, and so they were, everybody, all their families would be in danger, because it sounds like they emptied Philistia for this war.
Right.
So maybe they're mad at him because if you'd have just told him the truth, he'd have let you leave some of us behind to defend our families. That's interesting. If you had just told the truth. Again. But here's the difference between David and Saul, right? David takes strength in the Lord his God and calls for a priest and gets an answer. Which, interestingly enough, because they do the whole, you get a yes or a no answer type thing. Shall I pursue this raiding party? Shall I overtake it? And the response is not yes or no. But yes, you will overtake it, and you will surely rescue. Rescuing wasn't even a question. So he gets more information. Poor Saul can't get a straight answer. David gets bonus knowledge. So they've been marching for 3 days because where is that? Yeah, okay. And it happened, and this is the first verse. It happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day. So they've been marching for 3 days back from the front. So they're all already tired. And some of them are just too tired. Literally, it's kind of funny. So the way this guy translated is that, and 200 men who were too exhausted to cross the Wadi Besor. The verb that's used there for exhausted is related to the word for corpse. So if you wanted to go really literal, they were dead tired. So they stayed behind, and they found an Egyptian man in the field. They took him to David. So this was the practice of the Amalekites. I think part of this story is to show you how bad they were and why everybody was so worried about their kids, catching up with them before too long. Because the Amalekites, clearly, if you fall behind or if you get sick, they just leave you out in the wilderness to die. Which is what they did with the Egyptian guy. Which actually turns out to bite them in the butt, because he leads David's party to the Amalekites, who are also in this direct contrast. So they leave the Egyptian guy to starve and dehydrate in the desert, and meanwhile they're sprawled out all over the ground, completely prone because they're overeating and overdrinking, and then prone to a sneak attack, clearly. And David goes after him for 2 days, wins. Everybody's rescued, and here we have we're going to get the phrase used a couple more times. David restored it all. David took all the sheep and the cattle, and they drove before them that livestock and said, "This is David's booty." That word for they drove before them the livestock, is the same word that was used for the women and the children that the Amalekites did. They drove them before them. So they not only did they take them, but they herded them and drove them like cattle. Which you get, in verse 22 near the end. Only each man and his wife and his children, that they may drive them off and go. But you're still getting this kind of weirdness in the ranks, saying, well, these guys were dead tired. They didn't help us win this. Why should they get any of the loot? To which David says, they guarded the gear. You were able to travel light. Everybody gets something. They helped. Everyone's important. But what does David do with all of his loot?
I gave some to the elders of Judah.
Mm-hmm. Basically, he bought himself some political capital, didn't he? Sends gifts to all these people in Israel and in Judah. A lot of those places are probably those places that he was when he was wandering in the wilderness or in the desert areas or whatever. These were the towns or whatever that knew he was there but didn't tell Saul. Are you listening, Kieran or Keela? But I mean, it's a shrewd move, right? Butter up the people that you're about to come in and rule.
Well, and that, like you said, had covered for him.
Yeah. Even though, isn't that... Is it better to say political, or, part of me is thinking Godfather? Isn't it kind of one of those things? It's like, hey, I remember who my friends are. That was in Godfather, right? Something like it. So, you literally get a meanwhile here. So while all of that's going on, remember, Israel's under attack. The battle is going poorly. And Saul's sons are all killed, including poor Jonathan. And
Where you at?
this is 31, chapter 31.
How many times did Saul die?
Just once.
We died back here.
No, he didn't.
No, he was told he was going to die. Samuel died. Battle went heavy against Saul. Archers and bowmen found him, and he quaked with fear. There he is again. And so he basically tells his armor bearer to kill him. And the armor bearer won't do it. So he kills himself. And then his armor bearer kills himself. And Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all his men as well, together on that day. And the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, and they abandoned the towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. Major loss. And it happened the next day. So Saul says, kill me so that these guys don't kill me and then abuse me. So they didn't get the honor of killing him, but they sure did abuse him. So they came along to strip the slain. They found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head. And they stripped him of his armor. So, 2 things there.
So they take what's valuable from the dead?
Yep.
Right.
All the dead soldiers or whatever?
Yep.
They were vicious.
Why make more weapons when you can pull up weapons? Why make more armor when you can use the armor from... Big guy? Big guy. Head and shoulders above everybody else, right? I don't know if you remember this, but in the story of David and Goliath,
So what they do, nail them against the wall?
No, I stuck him on a stick.
It says from the wall of,
Yeah, but they put that stick on the wall. On the top of the wall.
so it didn't have no head though.
Nope. And clearly, because later on, at the end of the chapter, you hear that the people of this one town go and rescue the bodies, but it's not just him, it's also his sons that are up there.
Yeah, they burn them
Yep.
and take their bones
Yep.
and buried them under
Tamarisk tree? Yeah.
Tamarisk tree. And fasted for 7 days. There you have it. It must have stunk a lot back then.
Oh, yeah. You know, there's a.
Well, I bet.
I mean, think about the temple, though, where they had the offerings every day. There's a whole lot of, there's a whole lot of evidence for the fact that the reason that there's an incense offering every day is to cover up the stench of all the blood and stuff that's around from all the.
Yeah, and when
Yeah.
insects and.
Yeah. You'd be surprised at how many things that are given theological meaning actually come from very practical purposes. Like, have you ever been in the Catholic Church and they walk through with the incense, swinging it back and forth and stuff like that? You know how that got started? Peasants stink. They do. They just.
The people that came to worship.
Yeah, and so they would wave around the incense offering, or the incense as the offering, but it's to cover the smell. In the Eastern Orthodox churches, after they serve communion, they put a veil over the cup of the leftover wine, and the theological reason for that is to cover up the holy. Like Moses covered his face with a veil.
So what they use
The real reason was flies would get into it.
What they use for layers to burn people.
Oh, they built, like burning the witches, they would just put up dried wood and
Why?
twigs.
How do you start it? Would it be wax together or something?
Well, maybe, or just bring a torch from somebody's house.
Well, how'd the torch get lit?
Somebody else's.
Prometheus. Prometheus bought it for them. Nobody, you didn't let.
On the board.
I know, but
Well, I mean, they didn't let fires go out back then.
flares were beginning of mankind.
Civilization, really, yeah.
Fire.
Yeah.
So what? Like lightning hit, burns the forest, so they keep the wood
Yeah.
kindling and burning.
They just keep it burning, or at least the coal's hot and safe, so they can start it up again. You know the word bonfire? You know where that comes from?
Nope.
Every year during Samhain, which is now Halloween for us, they would everybody would bring the fires that were in their houses, and they would pour them into a common place in the center, and then they would bring the dried bones from all the animals that they've been eating for throughout the year, throw those on the fire. It was a bone fire, and then they would take flame from that fire to warm the household for the next year. So the word bonfire actually comes from bone fire.
So you were going to write something.
So anyway, when David is fighting Goliath, he's going off to visit his brothers, and he has 3 divestments, right? So he drops off food for his brothers, right? And then equipment he